December 9, 1965, a mining operation near Wenceslas Mine in Lower Silesia breaks through a concrete chamber 60 feet below ground. The workers find reinforced walls, scorch marks on the ceiling, and anchor points for machinery that no longer exists. The chamber matches descriptions given by former SS officers during interrogation 20 years earlier. They called it the testing site for Die Glocke, the bell. The bell was described as a device 9 feet wide and 12 to 15 feet high, constructed from a hard, heavy metal. 2 counter-rotating cylinders contained a violet-colored metallic liquid the Germans called Serum 525. When activated, the bell allegedly produced a pale blue glow and vibrations so intense that test subjects near the device suffered crystallization of bodily tissue. Scientists working on the project reported disruptions in electronics, temporal distortions, and gravitational anomalies within the test chamber. General Jakob Sporenberg, SS officer responsible for security at the test site, provided testimony before his execution in 1952. He confirmed that approximately 60 scientists and engineers died during the Bell experiments. Their bodies were cremated immediately. No records survived. Sporenberg stated that the Bell project operated under the direct supervision of SS General Hans Kammler, the same officer who managed Germany's most classified weapons programs, including the V-2 rocket. The project consumed more electricity than a city of 50,000 people. Official records show that Kammler disappeared in May 1945, days before Germany's surrender. His body was never recovered. Multiple conflicting death reports exist. Some witnesses placed him boarding a Junkers transport aircraft at Prague Airport on May 3, 1945. The flight manifest was destroyed. American intelligence documents declassified in 2001 reveal that Allied forces specifically searched for Kammler and the Bell project. Operation Paperclip, the program that recruited German scientists to America, included references to gravitational manipulation, research, and experimental propulsion systems. The bell was never found. Physical evidence supports the project's existence. The testing chamber near Wenceslas Mine contained ceramic insulators, identical to those described in testimony. Soil samples from the site showed unusual isotopic ratios, consistent with extreme electromagnetic exposure. Polish researchers documented the chamber in photographs before authorities sealed it in 1967. Those photographs vanished from National Archives in 1972. The mine itself was flooded and declared permanently closed despite containing accessible coal reserves. Igor Witkowski, a Polish military journalist, published detailed accounts of the Bell project in 2000 after accessing classified documents. He provided coordinates, structural diagrams, and witness testimony. His apartment was burglarized twice within 6 months. Nothing was stolen except research notes and backup drives. Witkowski relocated to Germany and ceased publishing on the subject. When asked about the Bell in 2008, he stated that certain topics attract attention that makes research impossible. The Horten Ho 229 presents a different category of suppressed technology. This aircraft flew in 1944. It remains the only jet-powered flying wing to achieve operational status before 1950. The German Air Ministry commissioned it in 1943 with specific requirements: cross the Atlantic, carry a 1,000-kilogram bomb load, and achieve speeds of 1,000 kilometers per hour. All 3 requirements would allow strikes on New York. The Horten brothers, Walter and Reimar, designed the aircraft using principles that would not reappear in aviation until the 1980s. The airframe incorporated carbon-impregnated wood bonded with sawdust and charcoal, creating a composite structure that absorbed radar waves rather than reflecting them. Wind tunnel tests confirmed that the HO 229 possessed a radar cross-section 60% smaller than conventional aircraft of similar size. The design anticipated stealth technology by 40 years. Flight testing began in December 1944. Test pilot Erwin Ziller flew the Ho 229 V2 prototype 3 times. REPORTING, excellent handling characteristics and speeds exceeding 800 kilometers per hour. On February 18, 1945, during the 4th flight, one engine failed. Ziller attempted to return to the airfield but crashed during the approach. He died from injuries sustained in the crash. The remaining prototypes were captured by American forces at Friedrichsroda in April 1945. The captured Ho 229 V3, nearly complete and awaiting engines, was shipped to the United States along with technical documents and tooling. It arrived at Freeman Field, Indiana, in July 1945. Military intelligence classified all materials related to the aircraft. The Ho 229 disappeared from official records for 36 years. When it resurfaced in 1982, it was stored in Maryland, disassembled and incomplete. Critical components, including the engines, control systems, and carbon composite panels, were missing. Northrop Corporation, the American company that developed the B-2 stealth bomber, had access to Horten Brothers research during the 1950s. Declassified documents confirmed that Northrop engineers studied flying wing designs seized from Germany. Reimar Horten, who survived the war, stated in interviews that American aviation companies requested consultations on flying wing stability problems during the 1950s and 1960s. He provided technical assistance under confidentiality agreements. The B-2 bomber, unveiled in 1988, shares the Ho 229's wing design, radar-absorbing materials, and twin-engine layout. Northrop maintains these similarities are coincidental. The V-3 supergun represents suppressed artillery technology that could have reshaped strategic bombing. Unlike the V-1 and V-2, which became famous, the V-3 remained classified by Allied forces for decades. This weapon consisted of a fixed artillery piece with a barrel 500 feet long. The barrel incorporated side chambers containing propellant charges that fired in sequence as the shell passed, continuously accelerating the projectile. This multi-stage propulsion concept enabled velocities exceeding 5,000 feet per second. Engineers calculated that a V-3 battery positioned near Calais could bombard London with shells every 60 seconds. Each projectile would carry 300 pounds of explosives. The fixed installation could not be relocated, but it could not be destroyed by conventional bombing due to protective concrete covers and underground positioning. Construction began in September 1943 at Mimoix, France. The installation included 50 barrels arranged in 5 batteries, all aimed at London. The British learned about the V-3 through intelligence reports in early 1944. Standard bombing raids proved ineffective against the hardened site. On July 6, 1944, Royal Air Force Squadron 617 used tall-boy deep-penetration bombs, specifically designed by Barnes-Wallis to destroy reinforced structures. The bombs penetrated the concrete and collapsed critical sections of the installation. The German army abandoned the site in August 1944 as Allied forces advanced through France. British and American forces captured V-3 equipment, documents, and personnel immediately after liberation. All material was classified. Public announcements mentioned only long-range artillery without specifics. Photographs of the Mimoix installation were not released until 1984. Technical specifications remained classified until 1997. The multi-stage propulsion principle was not discussed publicly until the 2000s, despite its potential applications in space launch systems and long-range artillery. Iraq's Saddam Hussein attempted to build a similar weapon in 1990. The Project Babylon supergun designer Gerald Bull, who studied V-3 documents through his security clearance, created designs for a gun with a 1,000-meter barrel capable of launching satellites. Bull was assassinated in Brussels in March 1990, shot 5 times in the head outside his apartment. The Project Babylon components were seized by British customs before shipment to Iraq. The technology remains suppressed not because it doesn't work, but because it works too well for nations to ignore the strategic implications. The Triebflügel interceptor illustrates how the most innovative designs vanished after the war. This vertical takeoff aircraft used a rotating wing assembly that spun around a fixed fuselage. 3 ramjet engines mounted at the wingtips provided propulsion and generated lift for vertical flight. Once airborne, the Triebflügel would transition to horizontal flight and achieve speeds of 1,000 km per hour at high altitude. The design eliminated the need for runways, allowing deployment from city centers, rooftops, or forest clearings. The Triebflügel project began in September 1944 as Germany's airfields suffered continuous bombing. Focke-Wulf engineers calculated that conventional interceptors required extensive infrastructure vulnerable to attack. A vertical takeoff fighter could operate from anywhere. Wind tunnel models proved the concept viable. The rotating wing generated sufficient thrust for vertical flight, while maintaining stability through gyroscopic effects. Ramjet technology, already demonstrated in other German projects, provided the necessary power. Full-scale construction began in January 1945. Blueprints showed an aircraft 13 meters tall with a wingspan of 11 meters when deployed. The pilot sat in a reclined position to handle the GI forces during rotation. Control surfaces on the tail section would manage horizontal flight after transition. Expected armament included two 30mm cannons with enough ammunition for high-altitude bomber interception. Allied intelligence obtained the blueprints when they captured the Focke-Wulf facility near Bad Eilsen in April 1945. The Triebflügel never flew. Components for the prototype were discovered in various stages of completion, but the rotating wing assembly and ramjet engines were missing. American technical intelligence teams cataloged the project and shipped documentation to Wright Field in Ohio. The file was classified. No American VTOL aircraft appeared until the 1950s, and none used the rotating wing concept, despite its demonstrated feasibility in German testing. In 1959, Lockheed experimented with a similar tail-sitting vertical takeoff design called the XF-V1 Salmon. The program was canceled after limited testing. Engineers cited control difficulties during transition to horizontal flight and limited operational advantages. The Triebflügel's rotating wing solution to these exact problems was not mentioned in declassified reports. Original German research remained classified until partial documents were released in the 1980s. Complete technical specifications have never been published. Viktor Schauberger's Repulsine presents one of the most controversial suppressed technologies. Schauberger, an Austrian forest warden with no formal engineering education, developed theories about water vortex dynamics that led to propulsion systems based on implosion rather than explosion. His repulsing device, built in 1945, allegedly generated thrust through centrifugal force created by rapidly spinning water or air in specially designed spiral chambers. Witnesses reported the device lifted off a workbench during testing, remaining airborne until power was cut. The German government brought Schauberger to Vienna in 1943 to work on classified projects. SS records confirm he received funding and facilities for special turbine development. Schauberger's son, Walter, later stated that his father was forced to develop the Repulsine under threat of concentration camp imprisonment. Several prototypes were constructed. Testing reports mentioned anomalous gravitational effects and self-sustaining rotation after initial power input. One prototype allegedly destroyed itself during testing, spinning so rapidly that centrifugal forces tore it apart. American forces captured Schauberger's equipment and documents in May 1945. He was detained and questioned extensively about his work. 3 months later, Schauberger was released and ordered to never discuss his wartime research. All prototypes and documentation were confiscated. Schauberger returned to Austria and attempted to reconstruct his work, but lacked the materials and precision equipment available during the war. In 1958, American businessmen approached Schauberger with a contract to develop his vortex technology in the United States. He traveled to Texas and worked with a research team for 3 months. The contract specified that all inventions and discoveries belonged to the American sponsors. Schauberger became increasingly distressed about the arrangement and suffered a breakdown. He returned to Austria in September 1958 and died 5 days later, telling his family that Americans had stolen his life's work. The Texas research facility closed abruptly. Equipment was removed and the building sold within weeks. Schauberger's principles of implosion-based propulsion have never been fully explored in mainstream aerospace engineering. His spiral designs appear in patents filed by major aerospace companies beginning in the 1960s, but always for conventional applications like pumps or turbines, never for propulsion. Researchers who attempt to replicate the Repulsine report difficulties obtaining funding and encountering suppression of results. The basic question remains unanswered. If vortex-based implosion propulsion doesn't work, why did the SS fund its development? If it does work, why has it been abandoned for 70 years? The Sänger Silbervogel represented Germany's attempt to develop a suborbital bomber capable of striking the United States from Europe. Eugene Sänger and mathematician Irene Brett designed an aircraft that would launch from a rocket sled, reach speeds of 13,000 miles per hour, and skip along the upper atmosphere like a stone skipping on water. Each skip would carry the Silbervogel thousands of miles further until it reached its target, dropped a 4-ton bomb, and continued skipping to land at a Japanese-controlled base in the Pacific. German Air Ministry documents show the Silbervogel project received serious consideration between 1941 and 1942. Wind tunnel testing confirmed the skip-glide concept. Sänger calculated that a manned vehicle could withstand the GI forces during atmospheric re-entry if trajectory and angle of attack were precisely controlled. The launch system required a 3-kilometer rail track, with rocket boosters accelerating the Silbervogel to 1,900 kilometers per hour before the aircraft's own rocket engine ignited. The entire concept anticipated intercontinental ballistic missiles and spaceplanes by decades. The project was shelved in 1942 due to material shortages and the shifting priorities of the war. The technical challenges were formidable but not insurmountable. The primary obstacle was fuel consumption. The Silbervogel would require vast quantities of rocket fuel for a single mission, making sustained bombing campaigns impractical. However, the concept proved the feasibility of suborbital flight for military purposes. American intelligence viewed it as a serious threat, even though it never progressed beyond planning stages. After the war, both American and Soviet forces specifically searched for Sänger and his research. The Soviets reached him first in 1946, offering positions and resources to continue his work. Sänger declined and returned to West Germany. The Soviet Union developed the Beria intercontinental cruise missile in the 1950s using principles nearly identical to the Silbervogel. The United States pursued the X-20 Dinosaur spaceplane, which shared the skip-glide concept and suborbital flight profile. Both programs were eventually canceled or classified. Sänger's original Silbervogel documents were seized by American forces and classified. Partial release occurred in 1974, but critical sections regarding atmospheric skip dynamics and thermal protection systems remain withheld. NASA's Space Shuttle, operational from 1981 to 2011, used controlled atmospheric re-entry techniques remarkably similar to those Sänger proposed. Boeing's X-37B, an unmanned military spaceplane, performs orbital missions using technologies that parallel the Silbervogel concept. Neither program acknowledges German wartime research as a foundation, despite the obvious connections. The Sonnengewehr or sun gun represents perhaps the most ambitious suppressed weapon concept. German scientists proposed orbiting a mirror 1 square mile in size at an altitude of 22,000 miles. The mirror would focus sunlight into a concentrated beam capable of boiling rivers, igniting cities, or melting military installations. Hermann Oberth, pioneer of rocket science, developed the concept and presented detailed engineering studies to the German military in 1929. The technology required for space launch didn't exist yet, but Oberth calculated that the mirror itself could be constructed using existing materials. The German Army examined the sun gun proposal in 1945 as V-2 rockets demonstrated the possibility of reaching space. The plan called for astronauts to assemble the mirror in orbit using components launched on multiple rockets. Sodium mirrors would form the reflective surface. Aiming mechanisms would allow precise targeting of any location on Earth. Power consumption for targeting systems would come from solar panels. The entire station could operate indefinitely once deployed. Allied forces captured the sun gun documents at the German Army Research Facility at Hillersleben. The files contained detailed plans, material specifications, orbital mechanics, calculations, and cost estimates. The project was classified immediately. Public mention of the sun gun did not occur until 1945, when American newspapers briefly reported on Nazi superweapon plans found in captured documents. The reports were dismissed as science fiction propaganda. Detailed technical analysis was never released. The United States military began studying orbital weapons platforms in the late 1950s. Project West Ford, launched in 1961, placed millions of copper needles in orbit to create a communications network. The Strategic Defense Initiative, announced in 1983, proposed space-based laser weapons for missile defense. Russia's Polyus weapons platform, launched in 1987, aimed to demonstrate orbital laser technology. All these programs build upon principles outlined in the 1929 Sunday gun proposal, yet none acknowledge the German origin of orbital weapons concepts. The sun gun remains relevant because solar power satellites and orbital mirrors are discussed today for energy collection and transmission. The same focusing principles that would create a weapon also enable wireless power transmission to Earth. The technology was suppressed not because it was impossible, but because weaponization potential made it too dangerous to develop publicly. The question stands if orbital mirrors have legitimate peaceful applications. Why does their German origin remain buried in classified archives? German electromagnetic weapons research yielded devices that allegedly generated directed energy capable of disrupting electronics or causing physiological effects. The Reatron, developed by Schiebold Company in Leipzig, produced electromagnetic pulses that could disable vehicle engines and aircraft electrical systems at ranges up to several hundred meters. Testing documents describe successful demonstrations in 1945 against captured Allied vehicles. Engines stalled immediately when exposed to the beam. Radio equipment failed permanently. British intelligence officer Tom Agustin investigated German-directed energy weapons after the war. His 1985 book, Blunder: How the U.S. Gave Away Nazi Super-Secrets to Russia, detailed the systematic looting of German research facilities by Soviet forces. Agustin documented the removal of electromagnetic weapons, prototypes, and the recruitment of German scientists to Soviet programs. The Reatron disappeared entirely. No Western nation has ever publicly acknowledged capturing functioning directed energy weapons from Germany. Despite extensive documentation of their existence, Soviet electromagnetic pulse weapons appeared in the 1960s. American forces encountered similar devices during the Vietnam War, where specialized Soviet equipment could disable electronics in aircraft and vehicles. The technology proliferated rapidly among Soviet allies. Western militaries developed countermeasures and shielding without explaining what they were countering. Electromagnetic pulse became a classified threat category. Public discussion focused on nuclear EMP effects, ignoring non-nuclear directed energy sources. Modern directed energy weapons, including microwave systems, electromagnetic pulse devices, and radio frequency weapons, trace their principles to German wartime research. The active denial system used by U.S. military for crowd control emits millimeter waves that cause intense heating of skin tissue. Similar effects were reported in German testing of the Reatron. The technology is presented as modern innovation, developed from scratch. German precedents are never mentioned in official histories or technical documentation. The question becomes, if these devices were primitive failures, why classify them for decades? If they worked, why deny the German origin? The answer suggests that acknowledging functional German electromagnetic weapons would require explaining why similar technology took 50 years to officially appear, and where the intervening development actually occurred. The Haunebu flying discs represent the most controversial and disputed technology attributed to Nazi Germany. Descriptions claim these were circular aircraft ranging from 16 to 70 meters in diameter, powered by unconventional propulsion systems, enabling vertical takeoff, hovering, and speeds of several thousand kilometers per hour. Alleged witnesses include former Luftwaffe personnel, concentration camp workers assigned to underground facilities, and Allied soldiers who encountered unusual aircraft during the final months of the war. Documented evidence is fragmentary and contested. No authenticated photographs exist. Several images claimed to show Haunebu discs have been proven to be post-war fabrications or misidentified conventional aircraft. However, witness testimony is harder to dismiss. Multiple individuals with no connection to each other provided similar descriptions of disc-shaped aircraft seen near specific locations, including the Skoda Works in Prague and underground facilities in Poland. The central mystery involves propulsion systems. Descriptions mention Vril or Thule technologies based on electrogravitic principles or mercury plasma vortex engines. These concepts parallel Viktor, Schauberger's implosion theories and involve rotating fluids or gases creating thrust through unconventional physics. No mainstream aerospace textbook acknowledges such propulsion as feasible, yet several German scientists, including Dr. Richard Meath and Rudolf Schriever, claimed after the war that they worked on circular aircraft projects and that functional prototypes existed. American intelligence documents mention unconventional aircraft sightings in the final months of World War II. Project Grudge, a predecessor to Project Blue Book, investigated reports of disc-shaped flying objects over occupied Germany. Some reports came from credible military pilots who observed aircraft performing maneuvers impossible for conventional planes. These reports were classified and not included in public Blue Book releases. The truth about Haunebu is likely somewhere between complete fabrication and revolutionary technology. Germany certainly experimented with unconventional aircraft designs, including circular wings and disc-shaped platforms. The Vought V-173 flying pancake, developed by the United States during the same period, proved disc-shaped aircraft could fly effectively. Whether German discs achieved the performance described by witnesses or employed exotic propulsion remains unproven. What is proven is that Allied forces specifically searched for circular aircraft and unusual propulsion systems, suggesting intelligence indicated something significant existed. Synthetic fuel technology was one of Germany's most successful wartime innovations and one of the most thoroughly suppressed after the war. The Fischer-Tropsch process, developed in the 1920s, converted coal into liquid fuels chemically indistinguishable from petroleum products. Germany produced millions of tons of synthetic fuel using this process, enabling military operations despite Allied blockades cutting off oil supplies. The process was economically viable and environmentally cleaner than conventional refining. After the war, Allied forces dismantled German synthetic fuel plants systematically. The Fischer-Tropsch patents were seized and classified. American petroleum companies lobbied heavily against synthetic fuel development, arguing it couldn't compete with cheap crude oil. The technology vanished from public discussion for 30 years, despite its proven effectiveness. Germany's wartime fuel production demonstrated that synthetic fuels could power a modern military without petroleum, threatening the oil industry's dominance. South Africa revived Fischer-Tropsch synthesis in the 1950s, facing international oil embargoes. The Sasol plants produced synthetic fuels on a massive scale, proving commercial viability. American oil companies attempted to prevent technology transfer from Germany to South Africa, filing lawsuits and lobbying for export restrictions. Despite these efforts, South Africa's synthetic fuel industry thrived. Other nations showed interest. American petroleum lobbyists ensured that U.S. government funding for synthetic fuel research remained minimal. In the 1970s, energy crises renewed interest in alternatives to petroleum. Congress funded synthetic fuel projects briefly. The Office of Technology Assessment published reports showing Fischer-Tropsch could produce fuel at costs competitive with oil if crude prices remained above $40 per barrel. Pilot plants were constructed, then oil prices dropped, and funding disappeared. The pattern repeated in the 1990s and again in the 2000s. Each time synthetic fuel became economically viable, market conditions shifted to make petroleum cheaper, and research programs were canceled. The suppression of Fischer-Tropsch was economic rather than military. Germany proved that technology worked at scale under wartime conditions. South Africa proved it worked commercially under peacetime conditions. The United States proved it understood the technology by seizing the patents and occasionally funding research. Yet synthetic fuel remains marginalized 7 decades later. Coal-rich nations, including the United States, could produce liquid fuels domestically, eliminating dependence on petroleum imports. The fact that this hasn't happened despite multiple energy crises suggests deliberate maintenance of petroleum dependency. These 10 technologies form a pattern. Each represented a significant advancement in its field. Each was documented as functional or near-functional when captured. Each was classified or suppressed. Each had economic or strategic implications that threatened existing power structures. The common thread is not that these inventions were Nazi ideology or war crimes. The thread is that they demonstrated principles that would disrupt established industries, military doctrines, or national advantages. Vertical takeoff aircraft threatened airbase infrastructure and billions in runway construction. Electromagnetic weapons threatened conventional military hardware and the defense contracts producing it. Synthetic fuels threatened the petroleum industry and oil-dependent geopolitics. Advanced propulsion threatened aerospace companies and their incremental development model. Orbital weapons threatened the entire concept of terrestrial military power. Allied forces didn't suppress these technologies because they came from Nazi Germany. They suppressed them because implementing them would destabilize the post-war order being constructed. The scientists who created them were recruited through Operation Paperclip and similar programs, put to work on classified projects, and forbidden from discussing their wartime research. The technologies were studied, refined, and occasionally implemented in secret programs, while public science proceeded as if they never existed. Consider the human cost. Viktor Schauberger died claiming his life's work was stolen. Rudolf Schriever, who claimed to have designed circular aircraft, died in poverty in the 1950s, stating that his inventions were suppressed. Eugene Sanger watched as both superpowers developed spaceplanes, using his concepts without acknowledgement. Dozens of other engineers, physicists, and inventors who worked on these projects were silenced through classification orders, threats, or simply being denied credit for their innovations. The pattern repeated across every technology discussed. The question isn't whether Nazi Germany developed revolutionary technologies. The evidence confirms they did. The question is why those technologies were systematically buried rather than openly studied and implemented. The answer lies in power structures that benefit from controlled technological development rather than revolutionary changes. Incremental advances allow existing corporations and militaries to maintain dominance. Revolutionary technologies create chaos, enabling new players to challenge established hierarchies. 70 years later, some of these technologies are finally emerging. Vertical takeoff aircraft are common in military applications. Directed energy weapons are acknowledged openly. Orbital systems dominate military planning. Synthetic fuels are slowly gaining acceptance as petroleum depletion becomes undeniable. Each innovation is presented as modern achievement, developed through decades of careful research. The German precedents are forgotten or dismissed as primitive experiments that didn't work, but they did work. The evidence is overwhelming when examined collectively rather than as isolated cases. The Horten brothers proved stealth aircraft were possible in 1944. The B-2 bomber proved it again in 1988. That's a 44-year gap for technology that already functioned. The Fischer-Tropsch process proved synthetic fuels were viable in the 1940s. Nations are still researching the same technology in 2026. That's an 80-year delay for proven chemistry. The pattern suggests that technology is suppressed not because it doesn't work, but because it works too well and in ways that threaten entrenched interests. The question becomes, what other technologies are we waiting decades to develop when the principles already exist in classified archives? What innovations could transform energy, transportation, or communication if research from 1945 were honestly examined and openly pursued? The Nazi technologies discussed here were created under terrible circumstances by scientists working for an evil regime. That context cannot be ignored, but the suppression of knowledge serves no ethical purpose. These inventions should have been studied openly, credited to their creators, and evaluated honestly. Instead, they were hidden, denied, and slowly reintroduced decades later with false origin stories. The cost of that suppression is measured in missed opportunities, wasted decades, and inventors who died knowing their work was stolen. If these stories intrigue you, consider subscribing to Investigator Squirrel. There are more buried inventions, more silenced voices, and more mysteries waiting to surface. What other technologies have been erased from history? Share your theories in the comments below.